Now, one advantage to sort of helping you understand and get a little bit more comfortable with the software is to realize that a large number of these tools work exactly the same as they do in all the sub-object modes. And so it's not so daunting when the majority of the edit geometry tools are very similar throughout the board. The only major differences is under each individual sub-object mode you have like edit edges, edit vertex. And in which case some of these tools are a little more specific to just that sub-object mode, which makes it a little bit easier to work with, knowing that a lot of these are going to work almost exactly the same. And so it kind of brings down the number of things that you have to learn. And so if we begin by looking at some of these tools here, by vertex isn't exactly something that I'm going to use much of. I know that it's going to select a series of edges that are adjacent just to an individual vertex. And so, for example, if we drag select around this area, we're still in edge mode, but this allows us to be bound to just the edges that are next to a specific vertex selection. Not something I'm going to use a lot of. Ignore backfacing works exactly the same. You drag select and you assume that none of the edges beyond that are going to be selected. Again, just like vertex mode, it's a little dodgy, but use with caution, and occasionally it should work correctly to ignore those backfacing. Shrink and grow work exactly the same. We grab one selection, we can grow it so that we grab the adjacent edges or shrink it back down. And so while we're here, let's start by making a cylinder. The ring and loop tools are probably best shown with a cylindrical shape. And we'll right click, convert this to Editable Poly, go to edge mode, hotkey 2, and we'll select a single edge anywhere along the topology here. This one's fine. Now what the ring tool will do is if we click that, this will create a selection all the way around the surface of the object that you have selected with all of the edge loops that are parallel to the edge that you select. And the loop tool is basically in the other direction, which is all of the edge loops that are adjacent to it, straight up and down and left and right. So for example, if we control click on either one of these and hit loop, we'll grab all the edge loops that go straight up and down and all the edge loops that go across. And if we grab this one and we hit ring, this will ring select all the way around the circumference of the cylinder. Now the constraints up here, these will work very similar to how we did before in vertex mode. And so if I switch this to a left view, and let's quickly grab one loop here. If I switch this to edge, now I can sort of pull this edge loop up and down the circumference of the cylinder just like what we talked about before. Now the create tool is basically going to allow us to grab a selection. Once you hit create, it's going to look like it switches to vertex mode, but essentially all you're doing is you're grabbing one vert and then left clicking on a next vert, which is be the target, and that's going to create an edge loop in between. There's another tool that's very similar to this, which is connect, that we used in the vertex mode, but create will do essentially the exact same thing. Now you won't be able to click anywhere else on the topology unless it is on a vertice, and that'll help you to constrain it to make sure that you're only clicking on from one point to another while you create an edge. Now the collapse tool is helpful for cleaning up topology. Let's say that we have this edge, and we want the two of them to come together at an individual point. We can hit collapse, and that'll basically snap the distance between the perpendicular edge loops next to it. And so it's really helpful for use in conjunction with ring. So we're going to grab a ring, and then we know that it's going to be, basically if you can remember, it's always the opposite of the direction that the edges is facing. And so if we hit collapse, that's going to smash that down into sort of the average by moving the edge loop just here perfectly in the center of them. Now the attach function, this is exactly the same as before with vertex mode. All we're doing is we're just attaching two objects together, and then detach will work as long as you have all of the edges of the object that you want to detach. You want to be careful about just grabbing an edge loop and then hitting detach itself, because now you're going to have sort of this unusual floating surface of this object that doesn't really make a lot of sense or doesn't have much need to it, and plus you've already gone and cut off half of your mesh over here. So you want to be cautious of that and make sure that if you're going to use detach in the sub-object mode, that you have all of the edge loops selected of that element. Slice plane, this works the same as before. We've talked about this. This will create your yellow gizmo, and when you're happy with it, you're going to left click on slice, Quick slice, same as well. This will create a long strip that just essentially just slices right through whichever way your viewport is facing, or you move the icon. M-Smooth and Tessellate, not to worry about that now. Make Planar. Similar before with vertices, we can grab a selection of edges. And let's start with a little bit better shape. This is getting a little ugly on this cylinder. We'll go 5x5 on this plane and convert this to editable poly. Switch to edge mode. And let's grab one of them and move it up just slightly to kind of intentionally mess it up. And so now if we grab all three of these edges and we hit Make Planar, this is going to attempt to sort of average out the distance based on the angle threshold between all 3 points. And so for example, if you can imagine, it doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot, but what it's trying to do is it's trying to just sort of average the 3 of them out so that the angle and the distance is fairly similar. Now if we had one edge here and we pulled him out and one edge here, we could hit Make Planar. And the whole goal of doing it from here is to create a flattened plane that isn't bent or isn't warped in any way, shape, or form. And so for example, if we click this, click it down slightly, remember that the goal for Make Planar is to simply flatten the surface out, not necessarily create it even and evenly distributed, so much as it is to ensure that the distances actually flatten the plane that it's connected to. Grid align, we won't worry about that. Relax will work exactly the same as it did in vertex mode, except we'll just sort of average out the size and distance of each other, of the edges. And copy and name selection we won't worry about much either. Now the real power of getting into edge mode is here under Edit Edges, and this is where we have a few unique tools that you can only find here inside of edge mode. Now remove will do very similar to what vertex mode did by grabbing a selection of edges and hitting remove, and that will basically try to get rid of those vertices. This is very different than grabbing the edges and pressing delete, where if you hit delete, that'll actually wipe out not only the edges, but the polygons that they're associated to. Now, one thing to think about when using the remove tool is, let's grab this cylinder, let's hide unselected, and let's select this edge loop here by clicking loop, and then let's hit remove. Now, at first glance, it looks like, hey, good job, we got rid of the edge loop, but what you want to be careful of is if you switch back into vertex mode, you'll notice that it is still keeping these vertices left over. This can be really bad once we start getting in the habit of modeling for games and bringing our asset into the game engine, because these are all basically floating verts that aren't attached to anything. And when we put it in a game engine, it's basically going to connect these verts together even though they're not associated with an edge loop. And so it's a good habit to get in that when you do remove an edge loop, that you're also getting rid of those vertices. Now the hotkey to remove edges is backspace. And so the quick way to get rid of edge loops and vertices is to hold down the control key and either click remove or hold down the control and hit backspace. And now if we switch to vertex mode, you'll notice that the vertices are gone. And so just always remember, if you are going to remove edges, and you will be doing plenty of that, always remember to hit control backspace when using that tool. Now split we won't necessarily be using a whole lot of, but the extrude tool, essentially what it does is if we loop this edge loop around and we go to click the extrude button, what it's going to do is it's going to kind of create 2 additional edges along the outside of the original one and sort of jut off from the surface of whatever selection that you have, sort of like this big flare piece that kind of pops off. Now if you click the dialog box here next to it, what you can do is you can sort of adjust the amount of height that you want it to fly out, as well as the width of the surface that you want to try to create. And so for example, if we wanted to create just a real thin sort of little piece of detail to fly around the outside of the cylinder, using the extrude tool is helpful for that. Now when we get into high poly modeling, this is going to be very helpful to create support control edges. And so if you're wanting to constrain the individual edge through the center, you want to have the height set to 0 and the width set to the value that you need. And we'll talk more about that once we get into high poly modeling. But for now, the general idea is to create an additional piece that kind of juts out from the outside of it. So we can cancel this. And weld, I won't necessarily use weld very much for edges, chamfer we'll be using quite a bit of. Now, essentially what chamfer does is if I exit out of this piece, and let's go ahead and grab this piece along the side, and let's detach that under Edit Geometry, Detach, and then we can get back into our Edit Edges mode. What we'll be doing for chamfering is essentially it'll take any of the edge that you have selected and split it and sort of attempt to chamfer it down to a 45-degree angle at an average if it's at a 90 degrees. And so, for example, right there we have kind of this 90-degree curve. Chamfer is going to add that little bit of a slight bevel to it. And so if we grab this edge, and this edge, multiple edges, by holding down Control and selecting the edges, we can click on chamfer, and this will chamfer all of those edges together. Also has a dialog box you can click and sort of help to control the amount or the value that you want that chamfer to take place. And you can even add additional segments in here using the dialog box. You wouldn't be able to do that by just clicking on it, but you can here if you use the dialog box that pops out. We can hit OK, and so now we have this nice looking kind of bevel on the edge of this box. Now, target weld for edges, again, this isn't necessarily something that I'm going to use a lot of. What I would want to do is probably go back and use the target weld or remove tools inside of vertex mode. Now, bridge is helpful for, let's say that we switch back to this guy. If we go into edge mode, and let's say that we had deleted out a polygon or two, we can just select those polygons and hit delete. And so what bridge will do is if we grab the two edges that are going to be parallel to each other and we click bridge, bridge will basically bridge the gap between the two spaces and plug up that hole that we have. So that's especially helpful if you're doing some cleanup or you want to throw down a quick face to patch that hole up. Now the connect tool is a very handy tool, and we'll be definitely taking advantage of this guy throughout this course. Let's say we grab these three edges. What the connect tool will do by default is it will attempt to bridge the distance between with an additional edge that will be basically half of the length up and down. It'll be basically exactly centered by default. And so if we hit connect, that'll add that extra edge loop right in between the two spaces that we have selected. And so, for example, for these guys, we can just hit connect, and that'll throw that single edge down in that selection spot. Now, if we go around to the other side, another tool that's helpful, or another part of that actually, is let's say we grab these three edges here, and we use the dialog box for connect. Here we can add additional segments if we need to. We can pinch those edges, which essentially will reduce or increase the distance between the edges, as well as slide those edges up and down. And so let's say we just put one, but we want it to be up here. We can hit OK on that, and that'll allow us to correctly move that edge up and down that surface. And so, for example, if we go to ring and we hit connect, rather than having to worry about constraints, what we can do here is we could just throw the edge down and use our slider to move it exactly where we need it to do, and it'll properly conform to the topology of the geometry. And once we're happy, go ahead and click OK. Now, create shape from selection. This is something that we'll use later. Right now, we're not going to get into that too much. It's kind of a little bit more of an advanced technique. Edit triangulation, turn, same with that. And paint deformation, you know, there is a paint deformation and soft selection utilities here inside the edge mode as well. And they work very similar to how we've done before in vertex mode. You still have the same tools with push and pull, as well as the soft selection that you can turn on and off with the fall off amount here. Once again, this is probably something that you'll use in vertex mode more than anything, but this is where those tools are here inside of edge mode. So let's delete these objects by creating a brand new scene, reset, say no, yes, and we'll start with a brand new 3D scene, basic box, convert to editable poly, hide the grid, bounding box, bring up our topology, and now let's talk a little bit about border mode.